you're going to hear a lot of things that sound very familiar. In my description here are my efforts to talk about 4 large-scale, long-term, meaning at least 18 months, PRRS control projects. Would obviously absolutely need to thank these other 3 people. You'll see throughout this the team effort that went into these projects, Dr. Arturo Oropeza, Dr. Jose Angulo, and Mr. Mark White. Why did we get involved in these systematic control programs? We were asked really because what the customers were doing today wasn't satisfying, or when they started wasn't satisfying. Whether it was how they used vaccine, how they were using virulent live virus exposure, etc., they just weren't having the successes that they wanted. And really we built this definition up front at the beginning of the very first one of these projects to have these be specifically internally driven to make them successful. The producers, the managers, the people on the farms really had to own this project and not feel like it was being forced upon them. We had to have clearly defined goals. I think Joe emphasized that very, very well and repeatedly, that a clear goal, what you want to accomplish with the project. A sustainable focus on reducing the circulation of PRRS virus in the growing and finishing population. We wanted to improve performance because this had to be financially viable for the producer to continue to do. But that also had the feature of reducing shedding from the growing and finishing herd back into the breeding herd. These were multiple site production systems, but as a lot of you know, within a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles of my sow farm, I may have multiple nurseries, multiple finishers. Yes, the individual facilities were isolated, but really these were regions with pigs of all different ages. So we wanted to be sure that finishing pig source was minimized as a risk for blowback into the sow farms. And we wanted a plan that was as simple as it could be, as repeatable as it could be, either to use in case of a break subsequently, or with what happened here, to expand it to multiple locations. We collected, obviously had to develop data collection forms. We used behavioral charts, or SPC charts, if you're familiar with those. That was the main tool we used for analyzing these streams of ongoing data. We did some other analytics, and we'll talk about a couple of those. Very intensive diagnostic monitoring, maybe more intensive than it would need to be in retrospect. We really wanted to learn a lot about the viruses and how they were moving. Did some things looking at CT values as a proxy for the amount of virus, knowing that's not perfect. And then looked at how virus circulated by site, by sequence, and did a few other analyses as well. So the materials and methods for these interventions, and each of these 4 are roughly the same. There were some minor differences between them, obviously, because they're different systems. But in general, similar goals and characteristics where the interventions were a move, designed to help a move from traditional multi-para sow production to parity segregation. So movement of animals between sites and trying to minimize the risk. Using a load, close, and homogenize technique that Dr. Connor mentioned. Closed the farm. Those times ranged from 147 to 210 days. And that was really driven by capacity on the farm. How many gilts could they load in and hold? How long could they stay closed? 2 doses of Engelvac PRRS MLV, 30 days apart, to the entire breeding population, so sows and gilts and everybody on those locations. Followed by an ongoing quarterly, and I have quarterly in quotes because it wasn't always every 3 months. One of these sites had some significant seasonal breeding issues. So to avoid any potential negative impact on August matings, for example, that vaccination was stretched out to 4 months with a gap and given in September. Little things like that, but in the big picture, roughly a quarterly mass vaccination of the sow herds. System B, you'll see here, did decide to mass vaccinate growing pigs that were within 2 miles of a sow farm. So back to that idea, thinking of this risk of exposure. We're going to minimize that risk. And in C and D, there was some homologous, and I'll use that in quotes, live virus inoculation of growing gilts. Piglets were vaccinated in all of these projects on an ongoing basis. Remember that goal of improving growing pig performance and reducing risk of blowback of shedding from the growing pig back to the sow. and certainly a lot of other things that weren't related to a bottle. Training, retraining on the training, etc. You get the point. Using pad wraps to understand processes that people were doing, biosecurity, vehicle cleaning and disinfection, etc. We used a routine sampling method to assess our virus status and performance, looking at the measurement part of our materials and methods. Productivity-wise, in the sow herds, we had these key performance indicators that were tracked. We sampled the ready-to-wean, that's what RTW, ready-to-wean piglets. When we began a farm, we would typically do 60, occasionally more than that, depending on the scenario, but always do 60 at startup with an ongoing monitoring level of 20 ready-to-wean, poor quality piglets, no more than 1 per litter, every month. And certainly when there was any type of a clinical sign, a clinical episode that we thought could be PRRS, you'd go in and do diagnostics in those cases on an as-needed basis. But those were not routine in terms of doing them by a calendar. Growing pigs were sampled at the end of the nursery. 20 serums when we began. The time frame of this began in 2009 and strung through last year, so we made the transition to oral fluids, as you would expect. 6 oral fluids. Mid-finishing, same kind of a concept. And instead of KPIs by farm by week, this was KPIs by production lot. So in that case, average data gain, feed efficiency, mortality, etc. And replacement gilts were sampled just like these animals. Here's a description of the systems. There's a lot more detail in a presentation that's online, and I'll have the link to that at the end of this. 4 different sites, 30,000 sows on 8 farms, 70,000 sows on 16, 24 on 12, and 22 on 22 farrowing sites. That gives you a little bit of an idea that the sow farm sizes range anywhere from 1,000 up to 5,000 sows each. Probably more local density here. In these situations, really, they were their own neighbors. 2 additional projects were described elsewhere, one by Dr. Dale Poulsen, one by myself and Dr. Angulo, that were very similar in methodologies. They were excluded from this paper, though, because they did not have that shift from multi-PRRS to parity seg, so that part of the process was slightly different. Don't memorize this, there will be no quiz. All this really is here for is to say it's a very complex process in terms of things you have to do. And Dr. Angulo gets great kudos because he was the one that used some of the software and put together the first of these Gantt charts to say, here's the activities. And the key message, everybody has to know what they're responsible for. What are the veterinarians doing? What are the key management people doing? Who's collecting the samples? Who's going to provide the production data back to you? How's that going to be validated? That process really has to be clearly defined before you start. Otherwise, there's a lot of samples coming through every month, a lot of data coming through, and the snowball gets really big really fast if you have to go back and try to edit that. And that leads perfectly into this, the data, the analysis, the interpretation. This kind of a model was used in a monthly setup. We would get the data, QC, it goes into charts, or if it's a special quarterly meeting, maybe some extra work, and then it's delivered to the customer every month. Then again, define those before you start. Things like this, understand the flow of the system, where pigs are coming from and going to. The results in the sow farms, remember we had this transition from multi to parity seg. So P1 farms performed inconsistently, and that's in terms of stability, our stability goal. If you had negative gilt development, those P1 farms with the load close homogenized really cleaned up beautifully and did very, very well. If that gilt development was field virus positive, a lot more variability in the month-by-month stability of those P1 farms, and I'll show you one example here in a few moments. P2 plus farms were very, very stable and repeatedly so. We would have an occasional recirculation of a resident virus or, in one case, the introduction of a new virus, but very, very repeatedly able to produce groups of negative weaning pigs month after month. We did detect vaccine virus in less than 1% of weaned pigs, so we didn't have to have that, we We had a concern at the start, wanted to be sure that vaccine virus would not shed from the sow to the piglet, either transplacentally or just a physical local spread. Since all of the animals, after the initial mass vaccination, had been previously exposed, that happened at a very, very low rate. We don't know what the source of those was. It could have been just a physical movement from the sow to the pig. It could have even been holdback pigs. That was occasionally something we uncovered when our supposedly non-vaccinated, ready-to-wean pigs turned up positive. People were pulling pigs back that had been vaccinated. And one of the significant goals, parity segregation, was established without clinical signs, even though we had very clear evidence that there was still field virus there. We found field virus in ready-to-wean piglets during this process without clinical signs from those movements. In the growing pigs, the field virus results, continuous flow sites made shrinking the dendrogram harder to achieve. In the projects that had very clear all in, all out by site and finishing, we shrunk the dendrogram. We excluded virus groups or families over time. When that wasn't the case, there was the ability of that virus to continue to circulate. That didn't happen. We reduced their prevalence, but they stayed around. And when MLV was found concurrently with field virus, we didn't see any negative effects. So did the control program increase or have the desired impacts? This is a very busy chart, and really we did this for the color coding impact of it. And this is from the P1 side of the multiplication side of System B, and you'll have those results. And all this really is if the box is yellow, that's detection of MLV vaccine in a ready-to-wean piglet here. This is the ready-to-wean piglet side. If the box is red, there's a wild-type virus found. If the box is blue, we found both. And that was really an important quality control check, if you will, in this part of the graph. It gave us a way to be sure we knew people were vaccinating piglets with the live vaccine. We expected to find it. But you'll see here in these gilt farms, there's a significant number of red boxes over time, and that's back to that idea of inconsistent stability. The gilts coming into these farms were field virus positive. And typically, if you had the gilt results here, you could watch that virus float downstream. Not unexpected. In the nursery populations, as you'd expect, mixed vaccine and field virus at first, but then eventually we're often able to replace that field virus just with vaccine virus. This is the same system, but the P2 plus farms, the P2 plus sow farms and their downstream flow. And you'll see a little bit of vaccine virus up front, but many more percentages of the white boxes. So much more consistent on the stability of those sow farms in that scenario. And you'll see here in nursery pig tested without depopulation of the sites, you couldn't completely push field virus out. When we could either depopulate a site or in some cases just with a lot of vaccine pressure over time, we were able to force the field viruses out of specific locations. The clinical impact in breeding herd control. That was one of the goals of the project, was to reduce that frustration of ongoing outbreaks. In the 4 complete systems, we had 5 abortion episodes involving resident PRRS viruses, so recirculation of something, abortions that were confirmed to be PRRS related. We also had 1 separate outbreak with a new field virus entering that system. But again, System B here showing you, yeah, those darn replacement gilt site was circulating field virus on an ongoing basis, and not surprisingly, we would find field virus back down here in the sow farm ready-to-wean piglet samples. But what I wanted to show here on this chart, right here, this blue arrow was when the sow farms were opened up, and we saw field viruses moving around, but we didn't see any abortions. The only abortion outbreak we had actually happened out here in 3 farms. So we were able to make these animal movements, these establishments of the parity segregated farms, and even though we knew we had virus circulating, we detected it, we didn't have clinical reproductive disease. To define those reproductive outbreaks in a little more detail, we had approximately 375 abortions in the outbreaks, or about 0.25% of the inventory. This sow farm month number really is for an individual sow farm for 1 month. That was a sow farm month. And we wanted to try to generate some number that gave a relative magnitude of the severity. How often did we see clinical disease? And we actually saw clinical disease in 7 out of 1,482 sow farm months where we had clinical PRRS-related reproductive disease, or about 0.5% of the time. So a dramatic reduction in the clinical situation in the sow herd. And a good chunk of these 375 abortions we created intentionally because animals were intentionally either re-exposed when a new virus was introduced into the farm, so as a way to eliminate it from a single farm, or when inadequate cool down didn't happen. And a live virus exposure, animals were still positive from their live virus exposure in gestation and then put into the adult herd too soon. So about 40% of those we intentionally created with our activities. We used a genetic distance of 3% to try to segregate viruses to say if they were the same or different. And again, that's not a perfect solution to do that, but for simplicity and the methodologies and the time frame, 2009, 2010 when we started, that's what we used. We wanted to know if we met a goal of 50% reduction in field virus, and again, did we shrink the dendrogram? This is a time series plot from System B, and yes, given time, we did reduce the amount of PRRS wild-type virus circulating in the growing pig herd. And this is the percentage of positive samples that are wild-type virus. So we were able to reduce the prevalence of wild-type virus in the growing pig. This chart compares System A, which is smaller, if you remember, than System B, 8 farms and 30,000 sows, versus 16 farms and 70,000 sows, and not surprisingly, smaller farms, fewer farms, faster resolution of that 50% prevalence. Projected here at 295 days versus 487 days in the bigger system. We did this really to help the customer have a reasonable expectation of what to see. How fast should you hit your targets? What kind of results should you hope to have? Could we shrink the dendrogram in System A? It was pretty boring. Yes, we did. Most of the sites were all in, all out. We were able to use vaccine, push virus out. System B is an example. No. More farms, much more closely physically related to one another. All in, all out by barn, but not all in, all out by site. What you do see, though, is you see from the beginning of the project a type 1 virus here. There's the vaccine. There's some North American types. And a couple more type 1 or European type viruses. And as you progress through time, you'll see that MLV really becomes the predominant virus that we're finding. And that was part of our goal, was to use MLV virus to help displace the field viruses. We learned a few things diagnostically, and I think many other people have seen the same results. I know Dr. Main from Iowa State helped us with some of these. After a period of time, unless we had a CT value of less than 33, for example, we didn't try to sequence an isolate, unless there was a clinical need to do the sequence. If it was just a routine sample and the CT value was greater than 33, we had a very high expectation based on our initial results that we were going to be unable to sequence it. So why spend the producer's money? We focused on these low CT values, or if it was a pool, we'd split the pool and try to get a better sample, or if it was clinically relevant, we'd go back to the farm and sample again. So we've kind of talked about the virus results. We saw a significant reduction in clinical disease in the sow farm, abortions. We saw a reduction in the amount of virus in weaned pigs, and we saw a reduction in the amount of virus in the growing pig. What about the money side of the deal? For the key production indicators, we tried to stay focused as we could on PRRS-driven things. So things like weaned per litter or aborts per 1,000 inventoried females were key primary parameters. Pre-weaning mortality or born alive per litter, less importance. In the growing pigs, average daily gain, mortality or culls, less important. Feed efficiency and days on feed, because those are things that certainly are less PRRS related. And we really focused on those 4. Did we see an increase in both mean performance as well as the ability of the system to meet its capacities, or in this case, its capability ratios? I mentioned we use a lot of SPC type data, so things like this. Yeah, the process mean changed significantly. It's now closer to the target. Their sow farms are more capable of reaching their goals, for example. And the production people like some of these kind of unique approaches. That there. We used a slightly different technique for some of the analysis. It's called an ANOM, or analysis of means. And think of it really as a visual version of an ANOVA. And we did that because we'd use these monthly SPC charts with the producers. So they had a real visual feeling for the data. And rather than dumping a page full of numbers back in their laps, we said, let's take a tool that's visual. So it reminds them of the charts that they're using. We also wanted to be sure we knew a slightly different valuation of the data. With the production charts, they're really designed to be conservative statistically. In other words, you know, every batch of pigs, there's going to be another number coming in. So it tells you to wait, look at the numbers, wait until there's a real statistically significant change in a number before you react. ANOM or ANOVA are more experimentally based, where you put a lot of work into getting a good data set and you want to be very, very sensitive. The key difference between ANOVA and ANOM is that the ANOM is visual, single step, and it compares groups to the grand mean rather than groups to the means of each other. And I'll show you that here. This will help. This is an ANOM of pigs born alive per sow Farrowed. This is the ANOVA output from a statistical package. So we can see in the baseline phase, this is the 18 months prior to load, close, and homogenize. Born alive per litter size was about 12.05 pigs per litter. Phase 1, that went up to 12.5. Phase 2, 12.7. Phase 3, about 12.7 as well. You can see the numbers right there, sorry. And you can see that using the ANOVA, phase 2 and 3 are not different from each other, but they're different than B, and they're different than the baseline. That's nice, and if you're used to looking at these tables, that's easy to read and understand. For the producer, they like this by saying, here's the grand mean of our born alive per litter for the whole set of data, 12.4, and it's really very clearly easy to see what's statistically different from each other with the picture. For average daily gain, baseline average daily gain, about 0.89. Phase 1, 0.99. Phase 2 went back down. There's a transition from corn to wheat in the diet. Feed intake went down. Feed efficiency stayed roughly the same. Pigs just didn't want to eat, so they didn't grow. And we were pretty clearly able to show that this average daily gain is significantly different from this one. This one's not significantly different than the whole period. Transition back to corn as your energy source, and average daily gain in the nursery of about 1.03 pounds per day. And that's combined with just about a 0.85% nursery mortality. So great nursery performance in a big system over a lot of time. These are the percentage changes in the production numbers. So it's a percentage change from the 18-month baseline to the first 18 months post-intervention. And in System B, there was actually more time post-intervention, but that's not included in that calculation, just because that project went on longer. But you can see a fairly repeatable pattern in improved mortality. And I think the number we heard earlier was a positive nursery. Might be expected to have about 35% greater mortality from your baseline. We saw some pretty nice reductions from that, so some of those numbers kind of fit. Average daily gain went up in most cases. Where they didn't was where we did dumb things, to borrow a term from some of our politicians. Average daily gain in System C, we had a continuous flow nursery site that was one of 2 nurseries that made that data up, and we didn't depopulate it. There were still positive pigs on the site, negative pigs began to come in, and that site stayed infected on a continuous flow basis. Vaccine helped to reduce mortality, as you saw on the previous chart, but the average daily gain didn't respond like we wanted it to. And in System D, some pretty significant enteric disease got spread around the system when some other vaccine changes were made. Lessons learned. We'll try to wrap up on time here. A significant system-wide before versus after improvement can be achieved. So big systems, a lot of moving parts, but with that focus that Dr. Connor mentioned about that commitment, you can significantly improve performance. And I said vaccine works, yes, but it's not just vaccine. And all the results in these projects were delivered with a disclaimer. The result of the project interventions led to this improved performance. It's not just vaccine. It's vaccine and it's better biosecurity, better cleaning, it's some flow changes. It's a process. We did reduce the PRRS virus wild-type circulation, like we wanted to 50% or less of the positive samples. So we decreased the proportion of wild-type virus. We increased the CT values in positive pigs. And since most of our virus types didn't change, we felt comfortable saying, yep, that really does correspond to less virus. And we detected a very, very low rate of MLB in the ready-to-wean piglets. We felt very safe using that product in the breeding herd and keeping it contained. Number of days to achieve a 50% reduction probably is longer for large systems. That makes sense. Set the right expectations, though. For when you begin one of these projects, it's going to be a long time. Don't let people get impatient or get discouraged if things don't happen as fast as they want them to. We developed a process to analyze the sequences using these standard methods and use things like BioPortal, which I really didn't show you here. Used PadWrap and other tools to really reinforce the biosecurity, to reinforce actions. We wanted to try to correlate the risk scores with the diagnostic results, which once you began to build data, you could do that. So really help the producer know with their own data why they need to do something. This is not an expert from the field or it's not a university study. It's your own data telling you if you do this, that something will happen. We got some creative measures for looking at cleaning and disinfection because that was something we thought was a problem. Looked at a lot of truck sampling, barns before and after cleaning. We used a modified live bovine coronavirus vaccine as a proxy for PED. Planted that in trucks, planted that in barns, and then saw if we could successfully eliminate that from the population. So that was a nice tool to really create some good awareness for people. And we helped the production staff answer their own questions. That one page of output from Dr. Angulo looking at the capability of the farms. They really liked that, and that was a question they asked of us. Are we really getting better? Are we really getting closer to our target? Dr. Angulo has published on the relationship of virus load to birth-to-market mortality. So when you start one of these projects up, there's a very clear correlation as the percentage of wild-type virus goes down, birth-to-market mortality goes down. Makes sense. And systems really were able to meet targets or make these real changes, and we used some of these different techniques like the capability ratio, QSUM, or the ANOM and ANOMR to help demonstrate that. Really have to thank especially Dr. Roger Main, Dr. Chris Rodemaker, Dr. Darrell Tomke, Dr. Ed Kuber, Dr. Dave Madsen, Dr. Pete Lasley. And Dr. Rodemaker has a video going into more detail on a lot of these projects right here. It's on Pork Network. Also need to thank the Boehringer Ingelheim Field Services and Solutions team. A lot of help with kit preparation, sampling, making sure diagnostics were coming in. our Health Management Center, as well as Iowa State University's Diagnostic Laboratory, and I'd say most importantly of all, the production staff in these 4 systems that really committed themselves to changing their practices and believing in the goals of these projects.